Welcome to the NatRefs Show, a weekly global podcast on sustainable cooling and heating technologies, brought to you by Shecco and supported by Teco. My name's Andrew Williams, and I'll be hosting today's show from Brussels, Belgium. I'm the European editor of Shecco's industry-leading websites r744.com, hydrocarbons21.com and ammonia21.com. I'm also the editor of Accelerate Europe and Accelerate Australia and New Zealand magazines. I'm joined today by my colleague in the US, Michael Garry, my colleagues in Europe, Charlotte McLaughlin and Dario Belluomini, and my colleague in the Asia Pacific, Devin Yoshimoto. This week, we'll discuss the Atmosphere America Conference on Natural Refrigerants in Long Beach, the launch by SCMREF Africa of a CO2 transcritical rack, the Vending trade show in Milan, and the FOOMA trade show in Tokyo. Now over to the United States for reporting from Atmosphere America.
Well, I'm here in Long Beach, California with my colleague Charlotte McLaughlin. My name is Michael Garry, the North American editor for Shecco, and we just finished the Atmosphere America conference. It was held here at the Hyatt Regency this week, and it was a really great conference for attendees and for Shecco. We had some really incredible speakers, a lot of networking, generally a very positive feeling about this conference. And one of the highlights was the keynote speech Tuesday morning by California State Senator Ricardo Lara, who is one of the leading advocates for reducing harmful emissions of HFCs in the atmosphere. And following his presentation, where he talked about some of the work he's been doing, Mr. Lara was named Person of the Year 2018 by Accelerate America magazine. Mark Chassero, the CEO of Shecco, presented him with the award following his keynote speech. And basically the award was given to Senator Lara for his efforts to phase down the use of super polluting HFC gases and helping to pave the way for natural refrigerant alternatives. Senator Lara is well known for authoring the Super Pollutant Reduction Act of 2016, which commits California reducing HFCs by 40% by the year 2030. This year, he introduced the California Cooling Act to combat what he has called the silent assassin of HFCs in refrigerators and air conditioners. And most notably, this California Cooling Act, if enacted, will authorize financial incentives for businesses, such as supermarkets, that are switching to climate-friendly natural refrigeration. The act has passed the state Senate, is now in the Assembly, and has a fairly good chance of being enacted into law this year. The California legislature has to separately authorize the use of the approval of the funding for the incentives, which come from California's cap and trade funding.
During Atmosphere America, we provided a lot of feedback to CARB through the policy session where everybody was in working groups discussing some of the proposals and what they would like to see from CARB.
That's right. Senator Lara, one of the reasons he came to Atmosphere was to get feedback from the HVAC and R industry, because that feedback, that support is really critical for this bill to pass and for the monies to be approved by the legislature. So Shecco has authored a letter in support of the California Cooling Act, and it's being co-signed by anybody in the HVAC and R industry that would like to co-sign this letter is welcome to do so. They can contact myself or Mark Chassero at Shecco. And now, Mr. Lara was Person of the Year. We also gave out 5 other awards Wednesday night at a reception at Parker's Lighthouse Restaurant right nearby the conference facility. It was a really fantastic evening, really a beautiful site. in Southern California overlooking the bay near the Pacific Ocean. And let me just say who the winners of those 5 awards were. Aldi US won the food retail, the best in sector food retail for its leading role in installing transcritical CO2 systems in its supermarkets. They have transcritical systems in over 100 stores, which is the most of any retailer in the United States. The winner of the Best in Sector Industrial Award went to Henningsen Cold Storage, which is installing a CO2 transcritical system, or has installed one in a new facility in Washington State. And that's on top of having engineered low-charge ammonia systems in 5 other facilities. So they've done both the low charge route and the CO2 transcritical route for the industrial sector. The Best Utility Award went to Source Refrigeration, based here in Southern California. They are one of the leading contractors when it comes to installing natural refrigerant systems and also training their employees on how to install and maintain natural refrigerant systems. The Best Utility Award went to Southern California Edison, which is one of the leading utilities when it comes to incentivizing natural refrigerant technology. And last but not least, the Innovation of the Year Award went to Colmac Coil for its ADX evaporator, low-charge evaporator system, which is installed in or will be by the end of the year installed in 70 different locations or 70 different systems, which is a huge installation base for this technology. Bruce Nelson, the president of Colmac Coil, designed this system to enable ammonia DX, direct exchange, for low temperature scenarios, which had never been done before. DX for ammonia was always for medium temperature, but now it's for low as well. And his innovative design was what really, plus the considerable adoption of this, was what earned him the award. So congratulations to all the winners. They really reflect the very best that we're seeing in natural refrigerants right now. And it was very exciting to give out those awards. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Charlotte.
Thanks, Michael. So another key thing that we heard during the event, during the policy session when we talked about standards, is that at the moment, the IEC national committees are voting on a very important standard to raise the charge limit in commercial refrigeration equipment from 150 to 500 grams. This is a crucial vote because the IEC subcommittee has already advanced it to the next stage. And these kind of decisions, they take years basically in the making. So if during these 2 weeks the national committees vote against in 2/3, that's it. The standard is dead basically, and they will have to wait for a whole new rulemaking process and everything to go through. As part of this rulemaking process already, they have tested hydrocarbon equipment, they have run tests in Germany. So, I mean, I just don't understand what the holdup is. And the EIA, we wrote an article about this and we interviewed them during during ATMO America in Long Beach, California, about this. And they're really calling on people who are involved with hydrocarbon equipment to talk to their national committees and really advocate for a yes vote.
That's right. That's a really critical thing going on right now. The charge limit for A3 flammable refrigerants is set now at 150 grams, but that really limits what can be done in commercial refrigeration. I mean, there has been a widespread adoption of hydrocarbon coolers and freezers with the 150 limit, but if you raise it to 500 grams, as the IEC is proposing, that would really expand the possibilities for adoption of these self-contained hydrocarbon cases in stores, and it would shake up things, and I think it would really, provide a great impetus to the adoption of natural refrigerants. So we're really hoping that the vote they need a 2/3 positive vote for the thing to go through. We're really at shecco hoping that happens. We're really promoting and advocating that people urge their national committees to vote yes for this proposal, and if that happens, it will go to a final vote at the end of the year, following a meeting in Korea by the IEC, and then it would be an international standard, and then countries like the U.S. and other countries can then adopt, the 500 gram limit themselves, which would make it mandatory in those countries. The IEC sort of sets it up as an international standard that can then be emulated by other countries. So we're hoping for the best. Marek of Embraco gave a great overview at Atmosphere about this, and he's not sure what's going to happen. He's the chairman of the subcommittee that's overseeing this, and he's kind of not really sure which way it's going to go at this point. So it's really a critical stage we're at, and we hope the thing gets approved so we can move forward and enable hydrocarbons to be an even greater natural refrigerant solution.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for. Back to Andrew.
Thank you, guys. Moving to South Africa now, one of the highlights of the recent Fridge Air trade show in Johannesburg was the launch by SCMREF Africa of the company's first CO2 transcritical rack. Now, the launch of this rack can be seen as an indicator of the growing penetration of CO2 transcritical into the South African market. We have just come back from the Fridge Air trade show and the Atmosphere Network conference that we organised alongside that show. That was hosted in conjunction with Commercial Refrigeration Services, CRS, another company who are making CO2 transcritical racks in Africa. So that's two big players now who are manufacturing racks in the country and offering them to the South African market. For SCMREF Africa, this is the first transcritical rack that they've made. The company was formerly known as Phoenix Racks, and its name changed to SCMREF Africa at the end of 2017 following its acquisition by the BioRef Group. Obviously, BioRef Group, a major multinational HVAC&R manufacturer. So certainly signs that CO2 transcritical is really taking off in South Africa with the entry into the game of SCMREF Africa.
Well, I'm curious, Andrew. In South Africa, while you were there, what was the temperature like, and what is the average? Because one of the things we always talk about is the efficiency of CO2 transcritical use in warm climates. Is that an issue in South Africa?
It's an issue everywhere, and yes, indeed, would be an issue in South Africa at the height of summer. We were there during the winter, but everything's relative. It was the Johannesburg winter. Johannesburg is quite high, at a relatively high altitude compared to the rest of the country, and it was still in the low 20s, the temperature. And during the summer, it would be pushing sort of 30, 35 degrees C in a lot of places in South Africa, and during heat waves even higher. So some of the challenges, the usual challenges that you hear about operating CO2 transcritical in the warmer ambient climates apply no less to South Africa than anywhere else. But as we saw at the Fridge Air trade show, and as we see from our partners at trade shows around the world, a lot of the technologies and technological innovations such as parallel compression, ejectors, etc., exist on the market already and are also readily used in in South Africa to address these issues.
Oh, that's interesting. So it does seem like CO2 technology is at a point where it's being able to be used in many different places. So in South Africa as well. It's really interesting to hear. When you talked to SCMREF, did they tell you a little bit more about the system and what their feeling was for the technology going forward?
Yes, so the rack that they had on display at the Frigidaire trade show, as I said, is their first CO2 transcritical unit. They described it as a small test unit that they're building for a customer and said it would be installed later this year. The rack has a cooling capacity of 18 kilowatts on the medium temperature side and 6 kilowatts on the low temperature side. And it was also fitted with a propane resilience unit. That's interesting, and helps to address some of these sort of climate-related performance issues. Grayling Wenzel, the design and production manager at SCMREF Africa, he said they decided to add the propane because as they're already using a natural refrigerant, it didn't make sense to fit R404A or R134A on the rack. So an interesting innovation there, adding the propane resilience unit as a way of making these systems more resilient in the warmer climates.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that before, having the propane resilience system. So it sounds like they're really committed to using natural refrigerants.
Yeah, exactly. And we talked a bit about the market opportunities in South Africa. Wenzel told me that there's a huge opportunity for CO2 transcritical in the South African market. So they're optimistic that there's a good growth path for these racks in South Africa in particular. He conceded that there is indeed a bit of a skills shortage, but he's confident that can be addressed. And as people become more interested and familiar with the technology and more people begin to use it, the costs will come down compared to traditional systems too. Obviously cost a little bit more of a challenge in South Africa than perhaps some other countries, but as with everywhere, as these systems become more widely used, those costs should fall. So certainly they were optimistic in the growth path for CO2 transcritical in South Africa.
Sounds good. And just to confirm, so these are systems for commercial applications?
Yes, for commercial applications that they're building. But we did hear from Commercial Refrigeration Services, CRS, that they're also using CO2 transcritical racks for industrial, both in South Africa and beyond. So there's certainly a market for CO2 transcritical on the industrial side in South Africa too. So that closes the Frigidaire segment, and on to another trade show that took place recently, Dario on Venditalia.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I visited Venditalia last week. Venditalia is one of the leading events in Europe for the sector of automatic distribution, and it gathers all the main European companies active in the sector of vending machines, water chillers, and coffee makers. Of course, shecco was visiting the event to understand more about the latest market trends and policy trends in the sector and to learn what kind of natural refrigerants are used in this kind of machines. The general trend that we discover from the event is that the sector is basically still undecided between CO2 and hydrocarbons. And this is by itself big news because until the last edition of the Fed that was held in 2016, the only natural refrigerant that was quite consistently used for this kind of devices was CO2. While as of this year's edition, also hydrocarbons started to be present at the fair, and some major companies like, for example, Sand & Vendo were presenting their latest prototypes using hydrocarbons and R290 more in details. So this is quite a big news, that is the fact that hydrocarbons are on the rise also for the vending machine industry. Quite unfortunately though, at least for the Italian market, the companies seem still to be slow in understanding the implication of the European F-gas regulation.
Okay, that's interesting because I was there at the previous edition in 2016, and that's the same message that they were telling me there. The kind of level of understanding of the HFC phase down deadlines put in place by the EU F-gas regulation seemed weak. Yeah. It's interesting that you say that the case remains the same 2 years down the line.
Exactly. I was actually talking with Enrico Capello, which is one of the editor of the Vending Press magazine, one of the leading Italian journals covering the automatic distribution sector. And indeed, he was telling me what you just confirmed, that is, Italian companies are quite slow in understanding the European F-gas regulation and in reacting to that. And in general, the sector seemed to be actually quite slow in understanding all the European regulation and from a general perspective. Indeed, now they are more focusing on lobbying against the possible new regulation that will ban mono-use plastic cups and sticks, rather than fighting the European F-gas regulation, which is already binding and which will imply a complete phase down of HFCs by 2022.
So moving on to sort of some of the trends among the manufacturers of the vending equipment, obviously natural refrigerants starting to make inroads into the vending sector in Italy, just like elsewhere. And there's some significant competition there between hydrocarbons and CO2. What was the picture about that competition that you got from the trade show floor?
Yes, I've been talking with some of the major manufacturers that were present at the fair, and I've seen basically that they are still undecided between which kind of substance to use. For example, Sandem Vendo and EPTA are totally going for hydrocarbons. They started already presenting some prototypes or even selling some units using propane and isobutane, while other big companies that are in charge of big market share in the sector, at least in the Italian market, are investing much more on carbon dioxide, like FAS, for example. And I was talking with one of their engineers of the technical department, and indeed he was telling Shecco that they were proud to present the Faster 1050 prototype, which is their first machine totally cool using carbon dioxide.
Okay. And also interesting that the EPTA group is opting for hydrocarbons in this particular sector. Obviously, EPTA, a big manufacturer of CO2 systems at larger capacities in the commercial and industrial sector, but EPTA going for hydrocarbons in the vending.
Yes, for this specific sector, already the 90% of their products is using hydrocarbons.
So yeah, well, certainly interesting to see these trends in the vending sector in Italy and wider Europe, and I suppose only good news for natural refrigerants if the competition between CO2 and hydrocarbons is so intense.
Exactly.
All right, thanks, Dario. Sticking with trade shows, FOOMA, the leading food machinery and technology exhibition, took place this week in Tokyo. Devin, you spent quite a bit of time at the show. What were your impressions for natural refrigerants there?
Yeah, well, in fact, the show is still going on. The show began 2 days ago on the 12th, and it's going to end on the 15th. And our colleagues from the Japanese office are still there covering the trade show. But I think we can already talk about pretty much one of the really most interesting developments for this exhibition. And as you said, this is the Food Machinery and Technology exhibition. So this is basically for all the food manufacturers, all the food processing companies here in Japan, and all these companies that are related to that industry, like cold storage warehouses or logistics facilities and distribution centers. Basically, all these companies need refrigeration systems and freezers. So one of the biggest things we noticed at the show this year compared to last year was a pretty clear direction towards using CO2, transcritical systems, as an alternative option for freon gases or HFC gases for the industry here in Japan. We basically wanted to highlight 3 companies that we saw exhibiting their CO2 transcritical systems for these industrial food processing applications. First one was a company called Takahashi Manufacturing, which was exhibiting their CO2 transcritical system, which was connected to a tunnel freezer, which is basically this freezing system that can freeze products like chicken, vegetables, and even these other Japanese, specialized foods. So they were displaying that unit for the first time this year at the exhibition. We talked to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which last year they debuted their 10 horsepower condensing unit, which is only CO2. This year they're displaying their 20 horsepower unit along with their own newly developed evaporator connected to that system, which they're planning to sell as a package in August. And then we also talked to Nihon Netsugen Systems, which we've been following for a long time. They're producing these CO2 transcritical systems now in Japan at their factory, which we announced earlier this year and last year. And they basically debuted it for the first time at this exhibition this year. And they're really excited because they had a really big booth, and we talked to the president of the company, Mr. Katsuhiko Harada, who told us that they're getting a lot of traction with these cold storage businesses and logistics facilities, and they're now starting to develop brine chillers and glycol chillers, because these systems can be used directly in the food manufacturing process and even for breweries. He was talking about making beer here in Japan.
That certainly sounds very interesting, and would represent a journey of CO2 transcritical into areas of the industrial sector that's perhaps not so widely used.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, Japan is really kind of showing that these CO2 systems can be used very effectively in these kinds of applications. I mean, the reason why these end users are open to looking at these systems is because of their energy efficiency in these temperature ranges, and also because Japanese subsidies are driving a lot of the adoption of these new systems to help people get away from using Freon gas. And the subsidy program is very successful. We reported on this last year, where the subsidy was extended not only to the commercial sector for supermarkets, but also food processing. Last year was only for cold storage facilities, but now they're including food manufacturers and food processors. And then also the government is helping with regulation. Also, we reported last year that High Pressure Gas Safety Act was revised to make CO2 gas less restrictive to be used and less administrative costs and administrative burdens. So all of this is just kind of pointing towards a direction of a real promising future for these CO2 systems in this sector here in Japan.
Yeah, and so interesting that Nihon Netsugen sees kind of positive future growth path for CO2 transcritical in industrial in particular, because obviously the competition there with another natural refrigerant, ammonia, is intense. Did they have anything to say about CO2 versus ammonia?
Yeah, well, when we spoke to Mr. Harada, he told us that there is the advantage that CO2 has over ammonia, which is basically there is still this people don't want to be using ammonia so much here in Japan because it's very regulated, and people are still hesitant to use ammonia because of its toxicity, even though we are seeing these low-charge ammonia systems come up around the world. Perhaps they're not gaining so much traction here in Japan because these transcritical systems are being developed, where transcritical CO2 has been used for a long time in commercial applications, like smaller commercial applications, from Panasonic and those types of companies. So yeah, I mean, it just shows that these natural refrigerant systems can develop in different ways in different parts of the world. Here in Japan, CO2 is definitely preferred over ammonia in this sector.
Okay, thank you, Devin. Thank you, Dario. And thanks, Team America. That brings this week's podcast to a close. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in next week for another great NatRef show.